Elon Musk had long believed that his childhood was an open book, one filled with memories of ambition, rebellion, and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. But as he sat in his private jet, staring at the handwritten letter in his hands, he realized there was a chapter he had never read. The letter had arrived unexpectedly, written in an elegant but slightly shaky script, addressed simply to Elon. There was no return address, only a few lines that sent a strange chill through him. It has been many years, but there are things you must know, things your parents never told you. I have kept them a secret for too long, but time is running out. If you wish to hear the truth, come see me. Margaret. Margaret. The name alone transported him back decades. His childhood nanny, the woman who had cared for him when his parents were too busy, who had wiped away his tears and read him bedtime stories. He hadn't thought of her in years, yet here she was, reaching out from the shadows of his past. Curiosity burned in him. He had spent his life chasing the unknown, unraveling the mysteries of the universe. But now, for the first time, the greatest mystery seemed to be his own past. What truth could she possibly be hiding? And why now? As the jet touched down in Pretoria, Elon felt an unusual sense of unease. He was used to the unpredictable, financial risks, engineering failures, even public scrutiny. But this felt different. This was personal. A car was waiting for him at the small private airstrip, a vintage black Mercedes that looked like it belonged to another era. The driver, an elderly man with a thick white moustache, nodded respectfully. "She's been expecting you, Mr. Musk." The drive through Pretoria was both familiar and foreign. The city had changed in some ways, but remained unchanged in others. The same dusty roads, the same sprawling jacaranda trees, their purple blossoms carpeting the sidewalks. He remembered walking under them as a boy, daydreaming about rockets and Mars, never imagining he would return under such mysterious circumstances. They arrived at a modest white cottage on the outskirts of the city. It was small, unassuming, but well kept, with a garden bursting with wildflowers. He stepped out of the car, taking in the scene, and then he saw her. Margaret stood in the doorway, her frame thinner than he remembered, her once dark hair now silver, but her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, hadn't changed. They studied him carefully, as if searching for something only she could recognize. "You've grown," she said finally, her voice softer than he remembered. Elon managed a small smile. "It happens." She chuckled, but there was sadness in it. "Come inside, boy. We have much to talk about." As he stepped over the threshold, an odd sensation gripped him, like he was walking not just into a house, but into a truth that had been waiting for him his entire life. The small cottage smelled of old books, lavender, and something faintly metallic, like the scent of time itself settling into the walls. Margaret moved slowly but with purpose, leading Elon to a cozy sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with worn-out novels and faded photographs. He scanned the room, looking for anything that might hint at the truth she had written about, but nothing stood out. Margaret settled into an armchair across from, studying his face as if memorizing every line. He shifted slightly under her gaze, the same way he had as a child when caught sneaking extra cookies from the kitchen. "You're wondering why I called you here," she finally said. Elon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I am." Margaret took a deep breath, folding her frail hands together. "There's something about your family you were never told. Something that even you, with all your intelligence, never questioned." His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" She reached into a small wooden box beside her chair and pulled out a bundle of aged papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. With careful hands, she untied the knot and placed the documents on the table between them. "Your mother and father were brilliant, no doubt, but their brilliance wasn't just natural talent. It was part of something bigger, something designed." Elon's pulse quickened. "Designed?" Margaret nodded. "Back when you were very young, I was more than just your nanny. I was brought into your life for a reason. Your parents were involved in a project, one that sought to enhance human intelligence beyond its natural limits." He stiffened, his mind racing. "You're saying they experimented on me?" Margaret sighed. "Not in the way you think. It wasn't some cold scientific lab with wires in your brain. It was something far more subtle, yet far-reaching. Your parents were part of a select group, brilliant minds chosen to push the boundaries of human cognition. They were given access to advanced research, methods that could accelerate intellectual development in ways the world wasn't ready to understand. Elon swallowed hard, glancing at the papers. What kind of research? Margaret hesitated, then gestured for him to look. He picked up the topmost document, a yellowed page filled with dense handwritten notes. His mother's handwriting. Cognitive enhancement through epigenetic stimulation, accelerated neural connectivity, long-term impact unknown. His breath caught in his throat. His entire life, his ability to grasp complex physics at an early age, his relentless drive, the way ideas formed in his mind like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, was it all because of some hidden influence? Margaret watched his expression carefully. Your intelligence is your own, Elon, but you were given a head start, a push towards something greater. Elon looked up at her, emotions swirling in his chest. Was this a gift or a deception? And if his mind had been shaped by unseen forces, what did that mean for everything he had built? Elon's fingers tightened around the aged papers, his mind racing. A head start? A push towards something greater? He had always believed his intelligence was the product of curiosity, relentless effort, and an insatiable drive. Now Margaret was telling him that something else had played a role, something engineered, something planned. He looked up, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. Why would my parents keep this from me? Margaret sighed, shifting in her chair. Because they believed it was for the best. You were a child. What good would it have done for you to know? Elon exhaled sharply, leaning back against the old couch. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, peering down into a past he had never questioned. What exactly did they do to me? Margaret hesitated, her eyes clouding with something between regret and caution. It wasn't just you, she finally admitted. There were others, children of highly intelligent parents, all part of an unspoken experiment. The idea wasn't to manipulate your mind directly, but to create conditions where your brain could develop at an accelerated rate, where the barriers of conventional intelligence could be pushed further than ever before. Elon frowned. How? Margaret gestured toward the papers. Through carefully controlled environments. Exposure to specific patterns of learning, controlled stimulation of the brain at crucial developmental stages. Your diet, the music played around you, even the conversations you overheard as a toddler, everything was designed to optimize cognitive function. Elon's jaw clenched. He had always known his upbringing had been different. His mother had exposed him to complex ideas at an early age. His father had pushed him to think in ways other children never did. But to hear that it was all part of a deliberate plan? That was something else entirely. Margaret continued, her voice quieter now. Your mother was one of the key believers in the project. She wanted to see how far the human mind could be taken if given the right circumstances. And you were one of the most promising results. Elon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The implications were staggering. His relentless problem-solving, his ability to absorb vast amounts of information. Was it really just him, or had he been molded into what he had become? He shook his head, setting the papers down. And my father? Margaret hesitated. He had mixed feelings. He admired brilliance, but he believed intelligence should be earned, not engineered. Elon scoffed. That sounded like his father. The man had always been cold, dismissive, as if Elon's successes weren't impressive but simply expected. Maybe now he understood why. Margaret reached for his hand, her frail fingers warm against his. No one forced you to be who you are, Elon. The project may have opened doors in your mind, but you walked through them yourself. You are still you. He wanted to believe that. But as he stared at the papers before him, one question echoed in his mind. If this was true, then how much of his life, his success, his ambition, was really his own? Elon sat in silence, his mind a storm of unanswered questions. The crackling of the fire filled the space between him and Margaret, but he barely heard it. He picked up the documents again, flipping through them, scanning the notes in his mother's handwriting. The words blurred together. Neurological priming, cognitive acceleration, enhanced neural plasticity. He recognized the terms, understood the science behind them, but seeing them in relation to himself felt surreal. After a long pause, he looked up. You said there were others. What happened to them? Margaret pressed her lips together, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. That's the part I never wanted to tell you, she admitted. Because the truth is, I don't know. Elon narrowed his eyes. What do you mean you don't know? Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. The project was never meant to be made public. It was funded by private investors, people who wanted to see the limits of human intelligence pushed beyond what nature allowed. But something changed. Some of the other children, well, they didn't turn out like you. A chill ran through him. Define didn't turn out like me. Margaret hesitated, then said softly, Some of them burned out. Their minds developed too fast, too intensely. They were brilliant but unstable. Some withdrew from the world entirely, unable to cope with their own thoughts. Others became consumed by their ideas, lost in obsessions they couldn't control. And then some of them just disappeared. Elon's grip tightened on the papers. Disappeared? Margaret nodded. The people funding the project, the ones behind your parents' research, when things didn't go according to plan, they shut everything down. And the children who were part of it, many of them vanished from records. I tried to look into it over the years, but there was nothing. No traces. Like they never existed. A sick feeling settled in Elon's stomach. He had spent his life focused on the future, on technology, on progress, on the next great breakthrough. But now his own past felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, deliberately hidden from him. And my mother? My father? They just went along with this? His voice was sharp, laced with anger. Margaret's expression softened. I think they believed they were doing the right thing, your mother especially. She saw your potential early on. She knew you were different even before the project started. And your father? Well, he was never the sentimental type. Elon exhaled, his mind racing. If all of this was true, then he wasn't just the product of hard work and curiosity. He was the result of an experiment that had been abandoned, its consequences swept under the rug. And the people behind it? They were still out there. He looked up at Margaret, his jaw set. I need to know everything. Who funded this? Who else was involved? If they kept records, I want them. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. She reached for a small wooden chest beside her chair, unlocked it with a key from around her neck, and pulled out a single envelope. I kept one last piece of the puzzle, she said. I think it's time you saw it. Elon took the envelope with steady hands, but his pulse pounded. Inside, he knew, was the key to the truth. And once he opened it, there would be no turning back. Elon carefully opened the envelope, his fingers steady despite the whirlwind inside his mind. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged, yellowed at the edges. It wasn't a research document or a scientific paper. It was a list. Names, dates, locations. Some were crossed out, others circled in red ink. His eyes scanned the page and his breath caught when he saw it. His own name. His name wasn't crossed out. It wasn't circled. It simply sat there along with a handful of others. But what struck him the most was the last entry on the page. Project Exodus, status unknown. He looked up at Margaret. What does this mean? Margaret sighed, folding her frail hands in her lap. It means the project never really ended, Elon. It just changed. The people funding it, the ones who started it all, didn't just walk away when things went wrong. They went underground. They kept looking for ways to refine what they started. And I believe they may still be watching. Elon felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Watching me? She nodded. And maybe others like you. You were one of their greatest successes, but you weren't the only one. Elon leaned back in his chair, his mind working at 1,000 miles per hour. He had spent his life pushing boundaries, dreaming of the future, believing in humanity's ability to evolve beyond its limitations. And now he was being told that he wasn't just an anomaly, he was part of something bigger. A carefully orchestrated experiment, a design. For the first time in his life, he questioned his own legacy. Had he really built everything on his own? Was Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, were all of these achievements truly his, or had they been inevitable? The result of something predetermined? He clenched his jaw. No, he refused to accept that. If they're still out there, he said, voice firm, I want to find them. I want to know what they did and why. If there are others like me, they deserve to know the truth. Margaret's face softened. I thought you might say that. She reached into the wooden chest once more and pulled out a small flash drive. I don't have all the answers, but I've gathered what I could over the years. Files, names, locations. It's not much, but it's a start. Elon took the drive, gripping it tightly. It's more than enough. He stood up, his mind already moving ahead, plans forming, next steps unfolding. He would uncover the truth. He would find the people responsible, and if they were still playing God with human intelligence, he would put an end to it. Margaret smiled sadly. Be careful, Elon. Some secrets are kept hidden for a reason. He met her gaze, determination burning in his eyes, and some secrets need to be exposed. As he stepped out of the small cottage and into the night, he felt something shift inside him. His past had been rewritten, but his future? That was still his to control, and he intended to write it on his own terms.